Finished book 467 yesterday, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, one of the most known dystopias among 1984 by George Orwell and Utopia by Thomas More. It was quite an interesting read. I also hadn't actually read a book in a long time, usually just listening to them. Brave New World describes a future in which everybody is happy now, a society engineered by a few to promote social stability, not genetically, but by conditioning embryos as they grow first in tubes, then in what one could call artificial wombs. One of the key ideas is that humans can be conditioned to like to do certain things and to dislike others. Additionally, methods of altering the development of growing human are used mostly to prohibit the proper development of normal human abilities in lower castes. There are 5 classes or castes, according to the Greek letters: alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. Additionally, there are distinctions such as alpha plus, alpha minus with the plus signaling higher status, and the reverse with the minus. The differences among the castes are not only on an intellectual level prominent, but the lower castes are also physically smaller and weaker. This is achieved by methods such as oxygen deprivation, resulting in brain damage, and the oxygen deprivation happens during the development in the tubes and the artificial wombs. The lower caste, the more standardized the work and the less ability to think outside the box. Most of the characters then work in such a factory, a fertilization factory, that produces humans to replace the ones dying in society. Through scientific process, the aging process has been halted until people die very suddenly, resulting in youthful appearance everywhere. 2 of these people, Bernard Marx, an alpha, but physically not up to alpha standards for some reason. There is a rumor that alcohol was in one of his tubes during development, or in his tube during development, and Lenina Crown go on a holiday to New Mexico into a not civilized area where people still practice religion and monogamy, amongst other things. In these reservoirs, called reservoirs, people still bear children in opposition to the now civilized worlds, where even the thought of motherhood is categorized as obscene. In the reservoir, they stumble upon a young man, John the Savage. He turns out to be the unknown son of Bernard Marx's supervisor, who also visited this reservoir with a woman, Linda, who turns out to be still alive, and having had a child, John. Bernard Marx seizes the opportunity to expose the director, whose last name I think is Tomakin, or his first name, of the child production factory, his supervisor and John's father, and brings both Linda and John to London. Linda, deprived for years from a normal way of living that includes taking Soma, a drug that seems to numb pain amongst other effects, cannot be rejuvenated and goes into infinite summer holiday until she eventually dies. Many seem to be interested in John, which gives Lena and Bernard a temporary influx of social status, but only until he begins to decline invitation to social gatherings around him, with him being John. The death of his mother Linda in hospital, combined with children staring at her due to her being overweight and for the otherwise youthful only appearances unusual aged appearance, causes frustration in John that leads to him trying to revolt against the system in some way or another. He decides to hold a speech in front of lower caste workers about to get the daily rations of Soma and throw the boxes out of the window. The boxes with the Soma. But most of them seem to not understand due to the limited intellectual capabilities. As Bernard Marx and a friend of his, also known to John, find him, his name is Helmholtz Watson, the police intervenes shortly after by mostly drugging all participants into agreeableness and bringing them to Mustafa Mont, the world controller for Western Europe. This starts a conversation with these 3 people and the controller, who appears kind, educated, and willing to answer all questions, partially acting as a let's explain it all narrator type. Different attempts at structuring societies have been made in the past. One experiment including an island full of alphas meant to self-organize. After a civil war and the death of 95% of the population, the remaining people asked the outside government for the old structure, consisting out of many of the lower castes, increasingly less people towards the higher classes. Countless ideas to improve different processes, resulting in a reduction of workload for different castes, have not been implemented due to providing function for the individuals. The jobs provide function for the individuals. And too much free time seems to have a negative impact. Religion is non-existent or has been replaced to some extent by the admiration for the founder of this new social order, Henry Ford, often referred to as our Fordness, or used in figures of speech such as for Ford's sake. In case you're wondering, Henry Ford in the real world has the exact same name. Books not optimizing for social stability are mostly banned or just not available. The lower castes are even conditioned with electric shocks as children when touching books to avoid reading, all for social stability. In the end, because Bernard and his friend Helmholtz Watson think too differently and do not fit into normal society, they get sent off to an island, just like everybody else who, despite all the conditioning, even during sleep, happens to think differently. Not thinking differently during sleep, but the conditioning is happening during sleep, a process called hypnopedia or hypnopedic conditioning. But as the world controller Mustafa Mond thinks this isn't really a punishment, it's basically the best thing that can happen to such an individual, since they can spend the rest of their lives with similar people doing what they want to do instead of trying to fit into society. Real science is for the most part not taught to the public. Only what is useful, again, what people need to know to do their jobs, but not what would create social instability. John is offered the choice to either stay in a normal society or not to. But this is not really mentioned that well in the book. It is just that I read the note from Aldous Huxley before, and in there he describes the process of giving John two choices. John decides to live in an abandoned lighthouse, trying to forget about Lenina. They both had interest in each other, beginning in the reservoir, but John felt too unworthy, and Lenina failed to not just think conditioned thoughts around partnership, mostly consisting of everybody can have everybody. But John is not alone for long. While self-punishing outside, people drive by, and eventually a documentary is filmed with hidden microphones and cameras. John doesn't notice, and then this leads towards people flying in with helicopters to see John, again famous, treating him like a zoo animal. Standing around the lighthouse, Lenina then also comes, but John, confused, whips her on the ground. It was unclear to me, the writer of this year, whether Lenina died in the process, so I asked ChatGPT, or in this case Bing AI. And it said, at the end of Brave New World, John whips Lenina as well as himself in front of the crowd. The spectators begin an orgy in which John takes part. The next day, overcome with guilt and shame, he kills himself. So yes, Lenina Crown dies at the end of the book, but well, I don't know if this is actually written into the book. Still unclear. John, realizing what he has done, hangs himself. Aldous Huxley added later that the story had a few faults. Mostly that John should have been offered an additional option that would not have led to insanity, but to sanity. He additionally predicts that within maybe 100 years or 2 to 4 generations, I think he said. I think the maximum was 4 generations at least. Many of the developments would take place within the society. Many of the developments he already described in the book and tried to basically include in the book. Everybody is actually happy. No, that's so I jumped a sentence. The difficulty of a modern interpretation, apart from the intentional crippling of many parts of the population, the caste system, the paternalistic removal of any media or opportunity to think on a meta level about society itself, might be in part due to the fact that apparently everybody is actually happy, at least in the book. It's not as easy as in George Orwell's 1984 to say good guys, bad guys, especially since the world controllers, but also the designers, if there were more than just Henry Ford himself, seem to have had actually somewhat good intentions. Given the long history of warfare throughout human societies, what is so wrong with optimizing both for maximizing stability as well as maximum happiness of all living people? And if this results in a system with intended enforced polygamy without childbirth, superficial science, but healthy and happy people everywhere in the civilized world, what is so wrong about this? And what kind of futuristic work is this even? A utopia or a dystopia?